So we're going to actually break down the evidence and information provided by the state. The judge wants to know what was it that you guys collected that you're able to unequivocally identify and solo out the defendant, Bryan Kohberger, as the suspect who committed this heinous crime against the Idaho 4. You guys, as a law enforcement expert, I'm going to break down some of that evidence for you and explain to you what evidence was key in identifying Bryan Kohberger and what ultimately was it that led to his capture, you guys. So for those who are not familiar with all the extensive evidence in this case and how it played out, I think this is a great recap for you to try to understand why the state was able to put Bryan Kohberger's team in such a clutch where they had to surrender and take this plea. All right, so let's dive into it.
State at this time to provide its recitation of its factual basis had this case gone to trial.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the organization of the recitation is different than what I think the court and the public may be familiar with from the probable cause affidavit and other documents. The state's evidence, as an overview, would show that back in March of 2022, when the defendant was residing at his parents' residence or was residing back in Pennsylvania, his home state, he purchased online a K-bar knife and sheath with an Amazon gift card that he had purchased shortly prior to the purchase of the knife, sheath, and sharpener. Jumping ahead, the end of June of that year, the defendant, Mr. Kohberger, moved from Pennsylvania to Pullman, Washington, which is right across the state line from Moscow, Idaho, for the purpose of pursuing a PhD in criminal justice at Washington State University. The state's evidence would indicate that beginning July 9th of 2022, Mr. Kohberger's phone began connecting to a cell tower that serves the area of the 1122 King Road residence in Moscow, Idaho. Now, I will acknowledge for the court and all present that there are many residences in that area. It's a dense population of mostly college-related occupants. Between July 9th of 2022 and November 7th, the defendant's phone connected to that particular tower during late night, early morning hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., on approximately 23 times.
All right, so let me pause it there and give a quick context, you guys. The reason why he's offering this disclaimer saying, hey, listen, we're able to get his phone pinging in this particular area over 23 times. The way the technology works is that you have a cell phone tower. When your phone goes inside the perimeter of that tower, the tower has, think of each tower like an antenna. And on that antenna, there's a perimeter, right? Where it can identify any phones that go into that perimeter. That perimeter may cover the entire, let's say, housing area where King Drive is. Well, inside that perimeter, there's probably, let's say, approximately, for example, 30 homes, okay, 30 residential homes in that King Drive area. So what he's saying is, though Bryan Kohberger's phone was inside that perimeter, it does not say where exactly it was or what house it was closest to. That's how that evidence can be easily challenged. It's strong circumstantial evidence for sure, but the reality is, say Bryan Kohberger had friends or associates who actually resided in homes or within that area on King Drive, then the evidence won't be as strong because you can easily counter that by saying, well, he has associates that live over here. So it's not uncommon for his phone to ping within the perimeter of the cell tower because he had a legitimate reason to be there. So that circumstantial evidence is important, but that's where the defense would have to bring some type of evidence basically countering what the state is trying to say. So the cell phone tower is good evidence, but it's not the best evidence. And the way this whole thing works, you guys, it's not just one piece of evidence that makes the case. It's the totality of all the evidence that comes together that paints the picture that the suspect, in fact, did and commit the crime, right? Now, you can have an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence. If you can't counter that, from the defense can't counter that, you guys, the suspect is a sitting duck, okay? So I like how he clarified that just so that everybody understands. So I hope that makes sense, okay? All right, let's move forward.
Now, I will acknowledge also, we do not have evidence that the defendant had direct contact with 1122 or with residents of 1122, but we can put his phone in that area on those times. In the interim, on August 22nd of 2022, Lake Tahoe County Sheriff's Deputy Darren Duke conducted a traffic stop in the early morning hour or late evening hours, about 11 p.m. On the west side of Moscow, on the Moscow-Pullman Road. This was a traffic stop of Mr. Kohberger's car, which turned out to be a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra with Pennsylvania plates. During the course of the traffic stop, Deputy Duke was able to obtain Mr. Kohberger's name, Bryan Kohberger, his phone number, and his address, which at that point was an apartment address in Pullman. We then move to the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. The state's evidence would show that early morning hours on that day, Mr. Kohberger's phone left his Pullman residence, which is an apartment in kind of the central northwest part of Pullman. That phone was then subsequently turned off at approximately 2:54 a.m. and remained off until approximately 4:48 a.m. on Sunday, the 13th of November. The state's evidence would include a trial, video surveillance of a business on the Moscow-Pullman Highway, just across the state line from Moscow, that would show a vehicle matching the description of the defendant's Hyundai Elantra entering Moscow at approximately 3:02 a.m.
All right, let me touch on that for a second. What he's saying is that during the time, the window of the crime that occurred, Bryan Kohberger cut his phone off, okay? He cut his phone off and then cut it back on. You guys, that is a very, very strong indicator of something going wrong, especially when you can look at the rest of his phone record and see that that's not a normal practice, right? Say, for example, he had a normal practice of cutting his phone off at night before bed and then cutting back on. That'd be a strong counter argument to make. But in this case, the window of the crime, that the suspected time that the crime occurred, his phone was off. Not only that, they were able to pull from a video surveillance camera from a business that had their camera pointing towards a main road that was within like a mile radius of the incident location. It was a white sedan driving past, okay? No license plate, just a white sedan. This is how they're building up the case against Bryan Kohberger and how all the evidence really started to come together and paint this beautiful picture. All right, so
that the investigators put together from businesses and residents then show the defendant's car, the white Elantra, as I've described, circling the 1122 King Road area, that neighborhood, starting around 3:30 or so in the morning. Comes into the immediate area of 1122 King Road, which is actually on a dead end, and then leaves several times. And approximately 4:05 that morning, the defense car had entered that area, was leaving, stopped at the intersection of King and Queen Road, did a U-turn, and the state's evidence would show that the defendant's car came back and parked behind and above the 1122 King Road residence. The state believes that its evidence would then show that the defendant entered the residence of 1122 through the kitchen sliding door on the back side of the residence, which is the side of the residence that would face the area above where the defendant's car was parked. The defendant entered the residence, went to the third floor, and with a knife, killed Madison Mogan and Kaylee Gonzalez. The defendant, as he left that room, for whatever reason, ended up leaving, or the sheath for a K-bar knife was left on the bed next to Madison Mogan's body. And I can jump ahead. That sheath was tested by the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab, and single-source male DNA was found on the snap of that sheath, as well as blood from both Kaylee and Madison and other trace evidence. But it's important to note single-source male DNA was on the snap of that sheath. The state's evidence would show that Xana Knodel.
All right, let me touch on this real quick because this single-handedly is one of the greatest pieces of evidence in this case that allowed them to identify Bryan Kohberger. Now, the way they went about doing it brought up a lot of questions, okay, in reference to privacy and things of that nature. But ultimately, this technique on almost reverse engineering DNA using companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe to find suspects has worked in a lot of upcoming cases, you guys. They're going to probably talk about it, touch on it here. I haven't seen this full clip yet, but this is so important. The DNA on the sheath, they ran it, okay, through the FBI database. They were unable to get a match. The reason why that's the case, you guys, is because when it comes to using DNA, if the suspect has been arrested before or their DNA wasn't taken from a previous crime that they're being investigated, they're not going to be in the database. All right, it's just like a fingerprint. Okay, the fingerprint's not collected unless it's picked up from a crime scene or a person was arrested and their prints were taken. Okay, so it's the same thing with DNA. That's the reason why when they ran it in the system, they didn't get a match. What they did do is they ran it through an Ancestry.com or 23andMe company, and they were able to find a match as it relates to someone related to him, and they basically reverse engineered, and they're able to identify him as a potential suspect. But let them get into that. Let's see what happens, or how they break that down.
Was still awake at this time. In fact, had taken a DoorDash order not long before this started. Her room was not on the 3rd floor. It was on the 2nd floor on the west side. As the defendant was either coming down the stairs or leaving, he encountered Xana, and he ended up killing her, also with a large knife. Ethan Chapin, Xana's boyfriend, was asleep in their bedroom, in her bedroom, and the defendant killed him as well with a large fixed-blade knife. Each victim suffered multiple wounds. I will state for the record that there is no evidence there was any sexual component or sexual assault on any of the victims. I want to make that clear so there's no speculation. There were 2 other roommates in the house, and they were already asleep. During the course of this, one of those roommates awoke, looked out her door not knowing what was going on, and saw the defendant, who was dressed in black with a black balaclava on, holding some sort of container in his hand. And she saw him leave the house through the direction of the kitchen where that sliding door is that I mentioned before. At approximately 4:20 that morning, so this would have been 15 minutes or so later, the defendant's car is seen on a surveillance camera for 1112 King Road, which is immediately next door to the west of 1122, leaving the area at a high rate of speed. And if the court were to see that, or anybody in this courtroom were to see that, you can see the car almost loses control as it makes the corner, heads north, and then turns to go south on Walinta, which is one of the only ways to get out of that part of town. The evidence would show that following that, the defendant in his Elantra drove south of Moscow. About 4:48 that morning, the defendant's phone comes back on. And the evidence will show that that phone was located south of Moscow, likely at a side road intersection with Highway 95. From there, the defendant's phone activity tracks it heading back north towards Pullman, Washington, where the defendant lived. About 5:26, starting approximately 5:26, various surveillance cameras in Pullman, Washington pick up the defendant's vehicle as he enters Pullman from the south and heads north and slightly west towards his apartment, where he arrived at approximately 5:30 in the morning. Later that morning, Sunday, the 13th of November of 2022, Mr. Kohberger's phone returned to the area of King Road. We don't know exactly what he did, but it returned to that area. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning. He was there for about 10 minutes and then returned to his Pullman residence. About 9:30, the state's evidence will show, evidence taken from the defendant's phone, that he took a selfie of himself on his phone in what appears to be the bathroom of his Pullman apartment with a thumbs up.
So the state is pointing out how Kohberger returned to the scene of the crime. Okay, this is not uncommon for a lot of cases, you guys. I've worked cases where suspects returned to the crime scene. I've had cases where suspects never left the crime scene. I've even had cases where suspects who were the offenders of a crime, robbery and murder, actually called 911 and pretended to be a witness. Okay, so the behavior of suspects are unpredictable. This is why you see investigators and officers treat people the way they do. You are all a suspect until further identified that you're not, okay? And in this situation, you have cases like this where you have suspects who want to go back and watch their work. They want to go back and admire what they did. They want to see how things unfold, that they have this emotional attachment to what they did, and they want to see the sadness. They want to see the reaction. They want to see how it's investigated. They have an obsession to see how these things unfold. But the theory here is that Kohberger had an oh shit moment, and he's like, oh my God, what I do with the sheath of the murder weapon, okay? Because they have not found the murder weapon, okay? And I'm gonna get into that, all right? I don't like that they took this plea deal and did not get any type of closure. No, we want to know why you did it. We also want to know where the murder weapon is. And we want to know how you planned it out and for how long you planned this out. We want to know the motive. Okay, I would not have allowed him to get into this plea deal without getting something tangible, so people could have the least a slither of closure to make sense to this act. All right, so that's interesting that he pointed that out. That's important. Okay, and again, it further ties him to the crime.
In addition to tracing the defendant's activities, as I've just outlined, on the 13th and leading up to the 13th, the state's evidence will show that following Sunday, November 13th, 2022, business records show that the defendant began searching for a K-bar knife and a K-bar knife sheath, as the state believes, to replace the one that was left at the scene of the murders. The evidence also will suggest that there were at least attempts by the defendant to delete or alter his purchase history on Amazon, where all these transactions had occurred. Later that week, the state's evidence will show that Mr. Kohberger went to what we would call DMV, motor vehicle licensing here in Idaho, in Pullman, to change his car registration from Pennsylvania to Washington.
As investigators, one of the most noticeable indicators that a person is being deceptive is when they start deleting their search browse history, text messages, changing phone numbers, like he said, changing addresses, license plates, things of that nature. When you start doing things like that, we pretty much know we're on the right trail, right? We've seen a lot of this with the Karen Reed case, right? Where you had people deleting and wiping clean everything. It's a very, very clear indicator of deception. So, this is good. This is good. Again, this is good police work.
Law enforcement at this point were aware of Mr. Kohberger, had been accessing information about him, were trying to find him. They located him in Pennsylvania, and they conducted what's called a trash pull. During the nighttime hours, agents of the FBI, who assisted immensely with this case, working with the sanitation department back in this neighborhood in Pennsylvania, took trash that had been set out on the street for collection, sent the contents of that from the Pennsylvania residence of the defendant's parents to the Idaho State Forensic Laboratory, where the lab experts there were able to identify DNA on a Q-tip as coming from the father of the person whose DNA was found on the knife sheath that was next to Madison Mogen's body in the bed. Subsequently, an arrest warrant was issued here in Idaho, and a search warrant was issued in the state of Pennsylvania with the assistance not only of the FBI, but the Pennsylvania State Police. Mr. Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home to return to Idaho. Upon his return to Idaho, a DNA sample was taken from him, and it matched the DNA found on the knife sheath next to Maddie's body at the crime scene.
Okay, pause. I may have gotten this wrong, but I don't know how accurate that is. And someone correct me if I'm wrong in reference to this. I could have sworn, I remember when this case first started unraveling, I was watching it from the beginning, you guys. I could have sworn that the way they acquired his DNA, okay, there was a lot of question regarding how the DNA was identified, how it led them to Kohberger's parents' house, and then how they found Kohberger through that. From my understanding, happened is they took the DNA from the sheath that they found and they try to run it through CODIS, okay? And that's the database that the feds use to pull DNA to match with suspects. No match. They then took that DNA and they ran that sample through a form of genealogy testing, okay? For example, Ancestry.com, 23andMe. And they received a match, and that match directed them to Kohberger's father, okay? Meaning that Kohberger's father may have submitted his DNA to Ancestry.com or 23andMe, okay? And then from there, they said, hey, this matches. We have a match of a male named, Kohberger, all right? And he lives here. Well, this man has a son, okay? And this son has a white sedan. And you know what? This is leading us to this house. So let's go and collect his trash and see if we can find a closer match that pinpoints and gives us a connection, a nexus to Bryan Kohberger. They suspected him, but didn't have anything to connect him. Minus the sheath, the DNA was a partial DNA match. It led him to the Kohberger's house, okay? Now, by collecting the trash, which they know they did, they found DNA in there that was a direct match to Kohberger, okay? They arrested him, and then when they finalized and got the match from him directly, maybe swabbing his cheeks or whatever, they were able to confirm 100% match from the sheath, or I guess the DNA at the crime scene next to the body, which is 100% matched to Bryan Kohberger. From my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that's how they did it. I find it interesting that he's not bringing up the genealogy testing, how they reverse engineered that whole thing, because there's a lot of speculation in regard to the privacy violations using that database, okay? The reason why I say that is because people submit their DNA to those databases in hopes of finding their connected roots to their family or where they were, what country or continent they came from, so forth and so on. They did not submit that DNA so that law enforcement can tap into it whenever they feel like it in order to solve a case, all right? So there's been some questionable studies regarding that and the validity of it. Is this a violation of people's, privacy, you guys? And so I like how he just hopscotched over that. Not saying that they're wrong for using it. I'm just saying, I don't know. But you got to tell me if I'm wrong. I may have looked into it wrong, but I could have sworn that's what was done. All right. And so these things have been used before to solve cases. All right. I've talked about it before on this channel. So I don't know. I'm kind of maybe he's going to talk about it. All right. But let's move forward. But just to give you guys clarity on how that works. If you're confused, ask me in the comments and I'll clarify. But basically, that's kind of my understanding of how that happened. Okay.
The weapon itself, the knife, has not yet been recovered. I can tell the court that the defendant's apartment in Pullman was searched, as well as his office. Spartan would be a kind characterization. There was virtually nothing there. Nothing of evidentiary value was found. And of course, we are now talking 6-8 weeks after the time of the killings. In Pennsylvania, the defendant's car was seized, and it was actually pretty much disassembled internally. And it also had been cleaned. There was a bucket of cleaner right beside it. So, Your Honor, at the end, the state submits that the evidence that I've given just a quick overview of, and that to present in court would consume weeks, which the state is prepared to do and has been prepared to do, would show that as the defendant has just admitted and pleaded guilty on November 13th, 2022.
So basically, this is the state presenting a summary of their strongest pieces of evidence describing how they connected this nexus from the murder to Bryan Kohberger. I think the state and the investigators, along with the FBI, did a phenomenal job. You guys, everybody played a crucial role in this from start to finish. And even though there's still some questionable theories, people are curious about, wondering about, at the end of the day, Bryan Kohberger admitted that he, in fact, is the killer, that he carried out this crime. We may not find out the motive now. You know, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a documentary with more details coming out soon. You know, prayers out for the family. Again, this is such a heinous and tragic crime, sick and sadistic crime. The question is, did he have other victims? Has he done this before? Was this a one-off situation? You know, the good news is that we have a sense of closure. There's still more questions. There's no doubt about that, right? I know that the investigator or the state, you know, kind of jumped over the whole genealogy testing. I don't know why, but you know, nonetheless, a tool is a tool used to capture killers, and this is exactly what they did. Great police work again. Anyways, any questions, ask below, you guys. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this. How do you feel about this case ending? Are there any loopholes or things that are missing? And if so, what is it? Anyways, with that being said, you know, good night. God bless.